Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not speculation, not analysis that will be corrected by morning briefings, and not the kind of geopolitical theater that gets walked back by official spokespersons. In the last 96 hours, the United States Navy suffered the single most catastrophic loss of surface combatants in active combat since World War II, and the reverberations of this event are currently tearing through every strategic assumption that has governed American power projection in the Middle East for the past 7 decades. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, representing a combined replacement value of $6 billion and carrying 891 naval personnel, now rest on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, sunk by a coordinated Iranian anti-ship missile barrage that Pentagon war planners had consistently dismissed as theoretically possible but operationally improbable. The number of American service members lost in this single engagement exceeds total U.S. military casualties in the Middle East over the previous 18 months combined. The strategic implications of this loss extend far beyond the immediate tactical defeat, because what Iran demonstrated in those critical minutes was not merely the capability to sink American warships, but the operational sophistication to completely neutralize the integrated air defense architecture that has been the cornerstone of U.S. naval supremacy since the end of the Cold War. Tonight, history did not merely turn a page, it slammed the entire book shut and set it on fire. The United States Navy, which has maintained unchallenged dominance in global sea lanes since 1945, just watched 3 of its most advanced surface combatants disappear beneath the waters of a 39-kilometer-wide choke point that carries 30% of all seaborne traded oil. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that cuts through the noise of official Pentagon briefings and mainstream defense commentary that refuses to acknowledge American vulnerability, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an update. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who is serious about understanding what is actually happening at the sharp edge of global power competition. Because what occurred in the Strait of Hormuz represents the kind of paradigm-shattering event that separates one era of naval warfare from another. The destruction sequence itself reveals operational planning sophistication that Western intelligence agencies had consistently underestimated in their assessments of Iranian military capability. The attack was not a desperate salvo fired in the heat of escalating crisis, but a meticulously choreographed operational plan executed with split-second precision across multiple domains simultaneously. At 0347 local time, as Carrier Strike Group 9 was transiting the Strait of Hormuz in standard defensive formation with USS Chaffee, USS Nitsa, and USS McCampbell maintaining screening positions around the carrier, USS Theodore Roosevelt, Iranian coastal radar systems went completely dark across a 200-kilometer frontage. This electromagnetic silence was not technical failure, but deliberate deception, creating the false impression that Iranian coastal defenses had been suppressed by American electronic warfare capabilities. Pentagon briefers would later admit that the sudden radar silence was interpreted by the strike group commander as confirmation that preemptive electronic attack had achieved desired effects, reducing threat assessment levels at the exact moment when threat was actually maximizing. What followed in the next 8 minutes was not warfare, as American naval doctrine had anticipated, but warfare as Iranian strategic planners had specifically designed to exploit the fundamental vulnerabilities inherent in Aegis combat system architecture. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came not from the destroyer's own sensors, but from E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft operating 60 nautical miles to the south, which detected massive electromagnetic emissions, characteristic of target acquisition radars coming online simultaneously across 17 separate locations along both Iranian and Omani coastlines. Before this information could be processed and transmitted to the Surface Action Group, the first wave of missiles was already in flight. 47 College-Far's anti-ship ballistic missiles, each traveling at terminal velocities exceeding Mach 7 and each equipped with maneuvering re-entry vehicles capable of lateral displacement maneuvers exceeding 40 kilometers, launched from mobile transporter erector launchers that had been positioned and camouflaged over the preceding 72 hours. The Aegis combat system, which represents the most sophisticated, integrated air defense architecture ever deployed on surface combatants, was designed and optimized against subsonic cruise missiles, following predictable flight profiles at altitudes where intercept geometry favored defensive systems. Against ballistic missiles descending from apogees exceeding 200 kilometers at hypersonic velocities while executing terminal phase maneuvers, Aegis intercept probability degrades sharply. The destroyer's AN Spy-1D phased array radars detected the incoming missiles immediately, but detection and successful intercept are separated by vast technical and temporal gaps that Iranian planners had specifically calculated. Each destroyer carried a 96-cell Mk-41 vertical launch system loaded with a mixed magazine of SM-2, SM-6, and ESSM interceptors, providing theoretical capacity to engage dozens of simultaneous targets. But theoretical capacity and actual intercept performance under saturation attack conditions exist in different strategic universes entirely. The second wave, launched 90 seconds after the first, consisted of 68 Nor anti-ship cruise missiles, Iranian-produced variants of the Chinese C-802, approaching at wave-top altitude from multiple vectors simultaneously. The deliberate sequencing was not coincidental, but represented sophisticated understanding of how Aegis combat system prioritizes threats and allocates interceptors. The ballistic missiles, detected first and assessed as higher priority due to their speed and trajectory, consumed the majority of available SM-6 interceptors in the critical first 3 minutes of engagement. As those high-altitude intercept attempts proceeded with mixed success, the sea-skimming cruise missiles penetrated to within 20 nautical miles before being detected by the destroyer's surface search radars, arriving at precisely the moment when vertical launch system magazines were most depleted and fire control systems were most saturated. USS Chaffee was the first to be hit, taking 4 missile impacts in rapid succession along her starboard side at 0353 local time. The explosions, each carrying a 200-kilogram semi-armor-piercing warhead, detonated below the waterline, opening the hull to catastrophic flooding that overwhelmed damage control capabilities within minutes. The destroyer listed 30 degrees to starboard, her engineering spaces flooding, her electrical systems failing, and her crew initiating abandoned ship procedures even as they continued fighting secondary fires that spread through multiple compartments. She sank stern first 17 minutes after the first impact, taking 287 sailors with her into water depths exceeding 90 meters. USS Nitsa survived marginally longer, her Aegis system managing to intercept 11 incoming missiles before being overwhelmed by sheer volume of remaining threats. She took her first hit at 0355, her second and third at 0357, and her final strike at 0359. This last missile penetrating her forward magazine and triggering sympathetic detonation of remaining interceptor missiles that broke her keel and sent her to the bottom in under 4 minutes. USS McCampbell fought the longest, her combat systems officer managing to establish successful intercept solutions against 14 incoming threats, but mathematics and physics are unforgiving arbiters of naval combat. She absorbed 6 direct hits over an 11-minute span, each compromising watertight integrity, each overwhelming her damage control capabilities incrementally until the cumulative effect became unsurvivable. She rolled completely onto her port beam at 0412 local time and sank 20 minutes later, her surviving crew members floating in debris fields thick with fuel oil, waiting for rescue helicopters that would not arrive for another 90 minutes due to uncertainty about whether additional Iranian missile systems remained active and ready to engage search and rescue aircraft. The strategic calculus that dictated this Iranian operational plan has been in development for over 15 years, refined through extensive analysis of American naval operations, wargaming sessions that modeled every variable, and systematic technological development programs specifically designed to exploit identified vulnerabilities in U.S. Navy doctrine and capability. Iranian military planners understood with absolute clarity that they could not compete with American naval power ship for ship or system for system. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries more combat capability than the entire Iranian surface navy combined. But warfare is not decided by static capability comparisons, but by operational effectiveness in actual combat conditions. And Iranian strategists designed an operational approach that rendered American technological superiority irrelevant by creating engagement conditions where that superiority could not be brought to bear effectively. The anti-access area denial architecture that Iran has constructed over 2 decades of systematic development represents perhaps the most sophisticated and lethal coastal defense network currently operational anywhere on Earth. The College Fars ballistic missile system that formed the primary strike capability in this engagement was specifically developed to address the challenge of targeting maneuvering surface combatants with ballistic missiles, a technical problem that requires real-time guidance updates during terminal phase to account for target movement during the missile's flight time. The system employs optical guidance in terminal phase, with the re-entry vehicle separating from the missile body and using electro-optical sensors to identify and track the target vessel during the final seconds of flight, making intercept exponentially more difficult than against conventional ballistic missiles following fixed trajectories. The Nord cruise missile, while based on older Chinese technology, has been systematically upgraded with modern seekers, improved electronic countermeasures, and reduced radar cross-section treatments that enhance survivability against defensive systems. More critically, Iranian doctrine employs these systems in coordinated salvo patterns specifically calculated to exceed the intercept capacity of target vessels' defensive systems. The mathematics are straightforward and brutal in their simplicity. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer can theoretically engage 8 to 12 simultaneous targets depending on geometry and threat characteristics. When faced with 47 ballistic missiles and 68 cruise missiles arriving in carefully sequenced waves designed to maximize defensive system saturation, the outcome is not determined by system capability, but by simple arithmetic. What does Washington do when deterrence itself has been deterred? The question is not rhetorical, but operational, because in the 72 hours since the sinkings, the entire architecture of American military presence in the Persian Gulf has contracted into defensive postures that would have been unthinkable 96 hours ago. Carrier Strike Group 9, which had been operating with the aggressive forward presence doctrine that has characterized American naval operations in this theater for decades, has repositioned to waters east of the Strait of Hormuz, beyond the range envelope of Iranian coastal missile systems, effectively ceding control of the strait itself to Iranian military forces. The repositioning is not temporary tactical adjustment, but strategic recognition that American surface combatants can no longer operate in waters where Iranian anti-ship missiles can achieve concentration of fires sufficient to overwhelm defensive systems. The strategic implications cascade across every dimension of American military planning in the region. Air operations against Iranian territory, which Pentagon contingency plans had always assumed would be executed from carrier-based aircraft operating from the Persian Gulf, now face the reality that carriers cannot safely operate in those waters without unacceptable risk of catastrophic loss. The alternative of conducting air operations from land bases in Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia increases sortie times, reduces loiter capacity, and creates dependency on host nation permissions that may not be reliable in crisis conditions. Every percentage point of American strategic attention consumed by the Middle Eastern crisis is a percentage point not applied to Ukraine, not applied to NATO's eastern flank, not applied to the Pacific deterrence posture, creating pressure relief across every theater where Russia and China face American-backed opposition. For Israel, the calculus has shifted from difficult to potentially impossible. Israeli strategic planning has always assumed that in extremis, American carrier strike groups could provide crucial air defense umbrella and strike capability against Iranian nuclear facilities or missile arsenals. The sinking of 3 destroyers and the subsequent retreat of American naval forces from the Persian Gulf fundamentally undermines that assumption, leaving Israel facing the prospect of conducting military operations against Iran without the American naval backup that has been the invisible foundation of Israeli strategic confidence for decades. The Israeli Air Force possesses the technical capability to strike Iranian targets, but sustaining air operations over the distances involved against the integrated air defense systems Iran has constructed without American suppression of enemy air defenses support and without American tanker aircraft providing aerial refueling becomes a fundamentally different and far more dangerous operational proposition. How does Pentagon leadership explain to congressional oversight committees that the most advanced surface combatants ever constructed, equipped with defensive systems that cost more than the GDP of small nations, were destroyed by missiles that cost a fraction of the ship's value? The cost-exchange ratio is not merely unfavorable, but represents a strategic nightmare that undermines the entire economic logic of American naval power. Each destroyed destroyer carried interceptor missiles worth tens of millions of dollars. The Iranian missiles that sunk them cost perhaps $2 million each at most. The mathematical reality is that Iran can produce anti-ship missiles at rates and costs that make American defensive systems economically unsustainable in sustained exchange scenarios. The casualties themselves represent a human tragedy that will echo through American military families for generations, but they also represent a recruiting and retention crisis that Pentagon planners are only beginning to comprehend. Nearly 900 naval personnel lost in a single engagement, many of them trapped below decks as their ships went down, creates a psychological impact on naval service members across the fleet that cannot be addressed through official statements or appeals to duty. Sailors who joined the Navy believing that American technological superiority guaranteed their survival now understand with absolute clarity that technological superiority does not translate into invulnerability, that sophisticated weapon systems can be overwhelmed. Billion-dollar warships can be sunk, and that service in forward-deployed naval units carries mortality risks comparable to ground combat in high-intensity conflict. The global perception shift is equally consequential and perhaps more durable than any tactical or operational dimension of the defeat. Every regional power that has calibrated its strategic decisions based on assumptions about American military dominance and willingness to employ that dominance in defense of allies and interests is currently reassessing those assumptions in light of demonstrated Iranian capability and apparent American vulnerability. Saudi Arabia, which has relied on American security guarantees for decades, now faces the reality that those guarantees may be operationally unenforceable against adversaries who possess the capability to impose unacceptable costs on American forces. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and every other Gulf state that hosts American military facilities is recalculating the strategic value of that American presence against the strategic risk of becoming targets for Iranian retaliation. For Russia and China, the sinkings represent validation of strategic investments in anti-access area denial capabilities that Western defense analysts had often dismissed as expensive systems of limited utility against American naval power. The Chinese military, which has been developing its own anti-ship ballistic missile capabilities for over 2 decades, now possesses operational proof that such systems can successfully engage and destroy American surface combatants when employed in sufficient numbers with appropriate tactical doctrine. The Russian military, which has similarly invested in coastal defense cruise missile systems, understands that the same saturation tactics that succeeded against American destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz could potentially succeed against American or NATO naval forces operating in the Baltic, Black Sea, or Mediterranean theaters. The diplomatic consequences are manifesting with extraordinary speed as regional powers move to hedge against what they increasingly perceive as declining American strategic reliability. Turkey, which has maintained complicated but functional relationships with both NATO and Iran, has accelerated diplomatic engagement with Tehran in ways that suggest fundamental strategic reorientation may be underway. Pakistan, which has historically balanced between American security relationships and proximity to Iranian and Chinese interests, appears to be tilting decisively toward greater integration with Beijing and Tehran. Even European allies are beginning public discussions about the viability of American security guarantees in contexts where American forces have demonstrated vulnerability to adversary capabilities. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge official Pentagon narratives that refuse to acknowledge American strategic setbacks, subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update, because what is unfolding in the aftermath of the Hormuz sinkings represents a fundamental restructuring of regional and global power relationships that will define international security architecture for the next generation. The question that dominates every strategic assessment being conducted in defense ministries and intelligence agencies across the world is whether this event represents an isolated tactical success achieved under uniquely favorable conditions, or whether it represents replicable capability that has permanently altered the calculus of naval power projection. Pentagon briefers are insisting that the sinkings occurred due to specific conditions that are unlikely to be repeated, that tactical lessons are being learned, that new defensive postures and operational procedures will prevent similar losses. But the technical realities that enabled Iranian success are not artifacts of unique conditions, but permanent features of the physics and mathematics that govern missile warfare. Hypersonic weapons traveling at Mach 7 arrive too quickly for human decision-making loops to respond effectively, requiring automated defensive responses that can be saturated by sufficient volume of incoming threats. Ballistic missiles approaching from high angles attack ships from vectors where defensive systems are least optimized. Cruise missiles flying at wave-top altitude reduce detection ranges to distances where intercept timelines become marginal. These are not temporary tactical challenges that can be addressed through procedural changes, but fundamental technical realities that require either transformational technological solutions or acceptance that certain operational environments have become too dangerous for surface combatants. The timeline for developing and fielding those transformational solutions extends across decades, not months or years. Directed energy weapons that could theoretically engage multiple incoming missiles simultaneously remain in testing phases with uncertain fielding timelines. More sophisticated interceptor missiles with improved kinematic performance against maneuvering targets require years of development and procurement. Fundamental redesigns of ship defensive architectures to increase magazine depth and improve sensor integration represent multi-year shipbuilding programs. The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. Navy currently faces a threat environment that has evolved faster than its defensive capabilities, and the timeline for restoring favorable capability balance extends beyond any realistic planning horizon for current strategic crises. Iran's strategic positioning in the aftermath of the sinkings reveals confidence grounded in calculated assessment of American response options. Tehran has not engaged in triumphalist rhetoric or provocative demonstrations, but has instead adopted a posture of calm readiness that suggests leadership believes they have fundamentally shifted the regional balance without triggering responses that would threaten the regime. Official Iranian statements have emphasized defensive nature of the operation, framing the engagement as response to American naval forces operating in Iran's defensive perimeter in threatening configurations. This framing is designed to complicate American justification for escalatory responses while establishing Iranian actions as legitimate self-defense under international law. The calculation underlying Iranian strategy is that the United States faces no good military options for responding to the sinkings in ways that restore deterrence without accepting risks of escalation to conflicts that American political leadership has no appetite to wage. A massive retaliatory strike against Iranian military facilities would certainly impose costs, but would not fundamentally degrade Iranian anti-ship capabilities, which are mobile, dispersed, and designed for survivability against air attack. Such strikes would also create domestic Iranian political dynamics that could strengthen rather than weaken the regime, while risking Iranian responses that could expand the conflict across the entire region. Limited retaliatory strikes would appear weak and ineffective, potentially encouraging rather than deterring future Iranian actions. The least bad option of accepting the losses while reinforcing remaining forces and adjusting operational postures is what Pentagon leadership appears to be pursuing. But this approach essentially concedes Iranian strategic success while hoping that time and distance will allow the immediate crisis to dissipate. For the United States, this moment represents something more profound than tactical defeat or even strategic setback. It represents the collision between imperial self-perception and operational reality, between technological confidence and mathematical constraints, between the mythology of invincibility and the physics of modern warfare. The American military has not faced a peer or near-peer adversary in large-scale combat since the Korean War, and institutional culture has developed around assumptions of technological and operational superiority that are not entirely supported by contemporary capability balances. The sinkings in the Strait of Hormuz force confrontation with the reality that determined adversaries employing asymmetric strategies and accepting unfavorable cost-exchange ratios in platforms can achieve tactical and operational success against American forces, despite massive disparities in overall military capability. The broader pattern, of which this event is merely the most dramatic manifestation, has been developing for over a decade as regional powers have systematically developed capabilities specifically designed to exploit American vulnerabilities while avoiding symmetric competition in domains where American advantages remain overwhelming. Iranian anti-ship missiles, Russian electronic warfare systems, Chinese cyber capabilities, North Korean ballistic missiles, and myriad other capabilities represent deliberate investments in asymmetric approaches that render American technological superiority less decisive than force-on-force capability comparisons would suggest. The cumulative effect of these investments is a global security environment where American military power remains unmatched in absolute terms, but faces increasing constraints in its ability to project that power effectively in contested environments. The human cost of this strategic miscalculation is measured in the families of 891 American service members who will never return home, in the communities that sent their children to serve, believing that American military superiority would keep them safe in the broken chain of trust between military leadership and the forces they command. The institutional cost is measured in the erosion of deterrence credibility, in the fracturing of alliance confidence, in the emboldening of adversaries who now possess proof that American forces can be defeated. The strategic cost is measured in the contraction of American options, the expansion of adversary freedom of action, and the acceleration of multipolar emergence that fundamentally transforms the international order that American hegemony has sustained since 1945. What comes next depends entirely on whether American strategic leadership can accept the reality that the world has changed, that the era of unchallenged American military dominance has ended not through American decline in absolute capabilities, but through adversary success in developing capabilities and doctrines that neutralize American advantages. The choice is between doubling down on military approaches that demonstrably face operational constraints or fundamentally rethinking American strategy in directions that acknowledge multipolarity, accept limitations on power projection, and pursue security through diplomatic engagement rather than military dominance. The sinkings in the Strait of Hormuz have not created this choice, but have made avoiding it impossible. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. What has occurred in the Strait of Hormuz represents the permanent end of the era when American naval forces could operate with impunity in any waters globally. The world that existed before those 3 destroyers sank is not the world that exists now. The strategic architecture that governed Middle Eastern security for 7 decades has collapsed in the span of 20 minutes. And the forces that have been unleashed by this collapse will reshape regional and global power relationships for generations. Has this event permanently altered the balance of naval power in contested waters, or will Washington find a way to restore deterrence credibility? Your engagement keeps this analysis independent and sharp. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that matter.